So you thought 2024 was a big year for abortion legislation? Well, 2025 started out to be even bigger, particularly with these new bills from Montana and Missouri. Welcome back to Beyond the Bill number. So today we're diving into two big legislative developments shaking up the abortion debate. Montana's push to criminalize abortion-related travel and Missouri's expansion of tax benefits for anti-abortion organizations. But before we get into those, let's just take a step back. And in fact, all the way back to the Munich Security Conference from a few weeks ago, which does sound a bit odd to talk about Munich in the context of abortion legislation in the
Yeah.
US. But it was a very unusual conference in a number of ways, mainly because it was where JD Vance announced the end of the post-Second World War world order and basically said to Europe, you're on your own, which has obviously caused massive ructions here as we try and align away from the US and seek new allies. But unusually, in the vice president's speech, he wasn't talking about the kind of things you'd expect at an international security conference. He wasn't talking about China or Russia. He was actually talking about abortion.
Oh,
So what he said was the threat that I worry about most vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. Rather, it is the threat from within.
oh.
So this language around the threat from within is something you obviously hear quite a lot on the right. It's the whole deep state thing. But in this respect, what he was talking about was free speech
Okay.
and what he sees as the erosion of free speech within Europe. He sees this as a very big threat to democracy generally.
Okay.
Obviously,
Okay.
other people might take it differently and see
Yeah.
some things that the current administration are doing as threatening democracy. But anyway, one of the examples he used, though, was very, very interesting. He rebuked the Scottish government for sending out letters in October 2024, and he claimed that these letters cautioned citizens that, in his words, even private prayer within their own homes may amount to breaking the law. So that's
Okay.
very interesting. And obviously, people in Scotland in particular were like, well, that's odd because we weren't aware that private prayer in people's own homes has somehow been banned.
Yeah.
And it turned out it's a very interesting case actually. So the Scottish government introduced a new law that said that you're not allowed to protest in a sort of overt way within 200 meters of any clinic that performs
Okay.
any kind of abortions or that kind of reproductive health care, which obviously a lot of clinics. So a lot of clinics will be advising women, even if they're not actually carrying out the procedures themselves, but a lot will be carrying out those procedures as well. So there's now this 200-meter buffer zone around them. Now, the reason the Scottish government introduced this law was because there's been a sort of severe rise in the number of organizations from America
No.
coming over and basically copying the American playbook of protesting abortion clinics,
Mm.
often in
Okay.
quite aggressive and unpleasant ways. Now, obviously, abortion is perfectly legal within Scotland, and the Scottish government didn't want women being harassed or threatened as they went into these clinics, so they've introduced this new law. The law is a little bit controversial because obviously you do have this conflict between free speech and freedom of expression, and obviously the freedom to walk into a clinic without being harassed. But the letter that JD Vance was referring to was a letter that was sent to residents who live within this 200-meter buffer zone. So effectively, their homes are included within this buffer zone. But it's not that they're not allowed to express their own opinions or pray within their own homes. The letter was basically just saying, make sure that you don't have posters up in your window that might be
Mm.
seen as intimidating
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
towards the youth of these particular clinics. It's that kind of thing. And so it was just to warn them that they were within the buffer zone, and therefore they need to be a bit careful they're not breaking the law. So this extreme reaction, though, by JD Vance is
Yeah.
quite telling. And the fact that this is what he would choose to focus on in a speech to the world's nations
Yeah.
about defense was quite startling, really, and it came as quite a shock to people. This is actually what seems to be that's most important to this particular administration.
It's really interesting because I feel like when we're looking at what's happening right now, you and I were talking before we started recording about some journalists talking about how there's so much chaos in the Trump administration and how we're all kind of getting a little distracted by these crazy things that they're doing. And maybe it's kind of hiding the true intentions of what the administration is trying to do. And you were pointing out that maybe we need
Mm,
to be a little bit more focused on what could actually pass instead of these kind of horrific things or crazy
absolutely.
things, like, to one side or the other. But it is interesting how much their intention is also right out there in the open. So, they did this in Munich. There's been so much talk about the women need to birth more. There's a lot of push towards anti-abortion, restricting abortion, all of these things. And in so many different ways, which we'll kind of get into with the two bills that we're talking about later, but even within the Trump administration and the news that's coming out. So at the beginning of March, Trump pardoned a lot of people who had broken into and blocked access to abortion clinics that were having federal prison sentences or cases. And since then, the FBI and DOJ released memos that they're going to stop pursuing these types of cases because of this pardon and kind of this new approach here in the States. And there's so many different ways that you can restrict abortion and kind of deter people from getting abortions. And there was this guy that was quoted in the Politico article talking about this, whose name is Herb Garrity. And he's a Pittsburgh-based anti-abortion activist. And he entered a Washington abortion clinic in 2020 to disrupt his operations and implore patients to not terminate their pregnancies. And upon the news of these pardons, he said, get out there, whether it's outside the clinic or inside or wherever you have to be to actually prevent unborn children's lives from being taken. The civil unrest here is just getting worse and worse. And this is one of that we've talked about a lot, this powder cake type issue here in the States where it is really divided. People are pretty much super pro the right to abortion or super anti the right to abortion. And it gets super heated. It gets super intense.
And somehow the country needs to dial it back. I don't know how you do that, particularly in the current climate, with everything that's going on. It just seems to be exacerbating rather than actually getting any better. So at some point, though, you're going to reach a limit. Something's going to happen. So dialing it back and actually learning to get on with each other and respect other people's opinions and views and let other people live their lives. We need to get back to that.
For all of the fanfare and kind of crazy political discourse that Project 2025 had last year, it is very interesting to see these first couple months of the Trump administration and how there's these different policies and these different approaches. And you can kind of see how it's actually getting into the Project 2025 of it all. It's not just some crazy bill that's getting proposed. It's a little bit more intentional and weaving, especially when compared to the first Trump administration.
Absolutely. It's far more efficient this time around, and a lot being driven by Project 2025. Which is definitely being enacted in certain respects. I mean, you can see this with the Department of Education and the moves there that we spoke about when we were looking at Project 2025 last year, abolishing the Department of Education, and here we go. I mean, the big shift isn't that people have suddenly developed these very strong religious beliefs and so on. People have always had religious beliefs. The change is, of course, that people feel they can impose their views on other people. And then it's no longer a matter of personal belief and personal behavior. You have the right to tell other people how to behave. And that's the difference between a free democratic society and a theocracy. And it's worrying when there are people who think that it's okay to move in the direction of being a theocracy, because that's not going to work out well for America. So at some point, there has to be this reassertion of the rights of the individual.
It's not just these laws that we've kind of seen in the past of we're proposing this law, it's restricting abortion, or we're proposing this law and it's allowing abortion. It's these interesting sideways approaches that curbing one aspect or the other aspect. And honestly, it's kind of a really smart time in this legislation that's getting proposed and passed and some of the stuff that we'll get into. But there's these different ways of funding these types of clinics over these ones or restricting movement. And there's just a very different approach that we're seeing now rather than true, false, it's allowed, it's not allowed. It's these other types of things that are kind of getting pulled in and influencing the issue and restricting access or enabling access even more.
Let's get into things then, Sarah. So where did we leave off last year on abortion laws?
So after the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs v. Jackson's Health Organization, states took wildly different approaches to abortion access. Some enacted near total bans, and this was through two different ways, either allowing trigger bans that were on their books that were in effect but not in effect because of preemption, so the federal law of Roe v. Wade allowing abortion, once Roe was stricken down, those essentially became the law. And so there was a lot of, I can't even remember the number. I think it was like 12 states immediately banned abortion when Roe fell because they had these laws on the books. But then there was also states that maybe had a trigger ban or didn't. They enacted stricter bans, newer bans, this kind of newer legislation. And we've been seeing a lot of infighting about that. Kansas is a good example of where the legislatures keep trying to impose bans and the states keep trying to, the state's residents keep saying no. And then there's others that reinforced protections, like adding abortion as a right to the state's constitution, codifying that right, other things like that. And the result has been a really complicated patchwork of laws that leave many people navigating these shifting policies from state line to state line, legal uncertainty, and honestly, just logistical challenges to access care.
And beyond these outright bans, some states have been getting quite creative. I mean, as you mentioned before, they've been coming up with new ways to restrict abortion.
Exactly. So some states have been diverting these federal funds that are going to their states into these crisis pregnancy centers. And these centers are organizations that usually discourage abortion while presenting themselves as kind of a medical facility that you could go for counsel. But their ultimate goal is to encourage you to not have an abortion. And then other states have introduced laws that making it harder for providers to operate either within them or providers outside of those states to operate. Meanwhile, states that support abortion rights have been passing shield laws to try to protect patients and doctors from out-of-state legal consequences when these states who have banned abortion are seeing people from their states going out of state to obtain something that they have deemed as illegal.
Okay, so well, that brings us to today's discussion then. So let's start with Montana. What is going on in the great state of Montana?
So Montana lawmakers are considering House Bill 609, which would make it a felony for someone to obtain an abortion that's deemed illegal under Montana law, whether it happens within the state or elsewhere. And this is especially controversial because it also criminalizes people who assist someone in getting an abortion, including family members or healthcare providers. And this assistance can be anything from providing counsel to providing transportation to providing money to pay for a pill or a procedure. So it's kind of a whole slew of actions that could be included.
Wow. So that certainly does sound quite extreme and a major escalation.
Yeah.
So how does it compare to what we've seen before?
Yeah, so this builds on what we have seen kind of in the last year of so-called abortion trafficking laws. And we first saw this in Idaho, and then it was quickly followed by Tennessee. And those bills, particularly from last year, focused on minors traveling for abortion care. But Montana's bill extends this idea to everyone. So it's not just trying to protect minors from being taken out of state to get abortions. It's actually for anybody that would seek to get an abortion outside of the state, because again, abortion is not illegal in Montana just for under 18s. It's, for everybody. And this is also part of a broader overall strategy to frame abortion-related travel as some form of trafficking that can make it easier to justify these legal restrictions, because you hear the word trafficking and you're like, oh God, want to stop that. So it's an interesting new approach.
It is, and it's a sort of very inflammatory language to use for women who are traveling to get healthcare. So let's just talk about what happened last year. What did Idaho and Tennessee do?
So like I said, Idaho really led the charge here with House Bill 242, and that made it illegal for an adult to help a minor obtain an abortion without parental consent. So this is kind of one of those situations where a teen wants an abortion, their parents might be anti-abortion, they might not feel comfortable talking to them, they might have a different adult that could help them, they want to get an abortion, and they need a little bit of support there. So that's kind of the situation that they were looking at addressing. And then in Tennessee, they followed with Senate Bill 1971, and that created a new offense called abortion trafficking of a minor, and it actually allowed for wrongful death civil suits in certain cases.
Wow, so that actually means that somebody could be charged with wrongful death over the death of the fetus during the abortion process, and actually go to prison for that.
Yes.
Yes. And so both of these two laws were enacted, right? So they are now the law of the land in these states.
Yes.
Okay, so there are other states, though, that I think that tried similar laws but didn't quite get the laws passed. So what were those states?
Yeah, so Alabama, Mississippi, and Oklahoma introduced similar bills, but they ultimately failed. And Mississippi's House Bill 1041 was a pretty interesting example where it imposed fines between $1,000 and $10,000 and prison sentences of 2 to 5 years for anyone aiding in abortion-related travel. But this bill also gave the state attorney general the power to prosecute cases even if the local prosecutors refused. And so it's kind of a really interesting approach where you might not want to prosecute your neighbor's daughter for doing this, but the state attorney general could say, nope, we're doing it and we're prosecuting. And, I don't really care if you care about this person in your community for seeking out this care. We are prosecuting to the letter of the law.
Okay, so yeah, very, very harsh laws. But Montana's bill is actually taking things a step further.
Yeah, exactly. Unlike Idaho and Tennessee, which focused on minors, this Montana bill, 609, is applying to anyone seeking an abortion out of state. So that's a really big shift and could have far-reaching implications, especially for people facing these medical emergencies later in pregnancy. In Montana, if you have a fetal abnormality or anything like that, they don't really have those call-outs in their abortion ban. And with the other bills, you can kind of see a argument that you are a minor, your parents are technically still in charge of you, you should have their consent. Like that's something that you can kind of understand. But restricting an adult person's right to leave the state to seek care that they're unable to get within their state is definitely an escalation.
It absolutely is. So, well, let's just switch gears for a moment, though, to Missouri. So Missouri are taking a different approach. What are they doing?
Yeah, so this is kind of one of those other ways that's a really creative approach to trying to restrict more through a way that you wouldn't necessarily see is the exact approach. And I think this bill is actually a really good call out for things that seem like they're really chaotic and crazy, and you're going to focus on one part of it without necessarily seeing the impact of what the bill could actually do. So Missouri lawmakers are working on House Bill 1176, which would expand tax credits for donations to these crisis pregnancy centers. And as a reminder, these are facilities that present themselves as a reproductive healthcare provider, but are generally focused on discouraging abortion and contraception.
Okay, so let's just get this straight then. So rather than just directly trying to prevent women from seeking out abortion or prevent people from helping women who are seeking out an abortion, they're coming at it from a different direction and saying, okay, well, let's use financial incentives for organizations that will actually do this persuasion. And often, obviously, persuading women under the guise of providing them with healthcare.
Yes, exactly. And this bill, what it does is it increases the existing tax credit from 70% to 100%, meaning that donors could completely eliminate their state tax liability by giving to these centers. And so what the concern is here is that a dollar for dollar tax credit is super rare because they essentially redirect taxpayer money away from public services like healthcare and education into private, ideologically driven organization. And in other words, instead of that money funding schools, roads, and hospitals, it's funneled into these crisis pregnancy centers that often provide misleading information and limited medical care as it relates to what care women might want, as in an abortion or contraception, and pushes them in the direction of either getting pregnant or keeping the baby. And so, like you said, it's not saying you can't have an abortion, but it is making the resources available and more available because they're more funded than something like a Planned Parenthood to kind of direct people in that way. So it's almost like instead of saying no, we're kind of just like diverting the train tracks to a different direction.
Absolutely. And there's another tax loophole angle as well, isn't there?
Yes. And so this kind of gets into what I was talking about earlier of people getting really focused on one part of the bill when not necessarily seeing the other part. So this bill does allow donations in the form of corporate stock, which means that wealthy donors could bypass capital gains taxes by getting a full state reimbursement depending on how much they donated. And this is a pretty unusual setup that really disproportionately benefits high-income individuals. And it is raising even further questions about whether this bill is actually to help pregnant people and to help keep abortion at bay, or if it's just kind of creating a tax shelter. That dollar for dollar and now this kind of stock part, people are really focused on because people get really up in arms about taxes, and then you're not necessarily thinking about the other piece of this where it's like, yeah, I mean, this is problematic on the tax front, and like, let's talk about that, because we should be having our money go to roads and infrastructure and healthcare and education and those types of things, but also a huge impact of overfunding these types of things will be less access to abortion.
Okay, all right. So it's an interesting approach, quite a radical approach. Is Missouri the only state that's doing this?
No. So right now there's 53 bills that reference pregnancy resource centers, which is a little bit more of a diluted term for these pregnancy crisis centers. There's only 23 bills that directly mention that. And Texas actually has the most that directly mention a crisis pregnancy center, whereas Kansas leads the way with 24 bills addressing pregnancy resource centers. And a lot of these bills have to do with these states directing additional federal funding to these centers as a means to kind of curb abortion, although that's obviously not called out necessarily in the legislation. But it's a really growing trend amongst these conservative legislatures.
So this is even in states where abortion is already banned. So Texas, as we know, has very strict laws against abortion, but that's still promoting this kind of thing. It does really show how different states tackle abortion access in completely opposite ways.
The restriction of access as is an issue. And, you know, it's something that we've all been so focused on tackling. But these states that support abortion rights are actively trying to reinforce these legal protections. And it's just a really polarized landscape, and it really depends entirely where you live. It's so convoluted and in the weeds, and these really interesting approaches where you have to really sit with a bill and be like, okay, the bill says this, it would do this as it says in the bill, but then what are the ultimate impacts of these other things that it will do, and how does that influence other things?
One of the refreshing things about Project 2025, of course, was that it was completely open about what it was trying to do. The document, which was published on the internet, made absolutely no bones about what the strategy is here. These bills obviously being slightly more underhand about it. So if they do become law in these states, then they're probably going to face legal challenges.
Yeah. One, there's right to free travel is definitely something that I think will be up for contention soon. And it's going to create uncertainty and fear until we kind of understand what we can do and what we can't do. And we can also expect that because there are these tax implications and maybe a loophole for the wealthy in that Missouri bill, we assume that that will also create some legal challenges and people kind of being upset about that.
So yeah, it will be really interesting to see how these bills unfold and how these attempts at moving into other areas of the world, aside from just restricting abortion access, will go. So once telling people where they can go and what they can do and money are involved, who knows what's going to happen.
Yes, exactly. So we'll keep tracking the developments on these types of bills, these two bills as they unfold. I'm sure there will be some other really interesting approaches that we'll see throughout this year that we will also look at. And that reminds us all to not forget to look beyond the bill number.
Yes, absolutely. Look beyond the bill number, and don't forget also to like and subscribe. Any comments that you've got, put them below, and we'll catch you next time.